In this lesson, we'll explore the various functions that are available to simulate and verify your toolpath. Specifically, we're going to explore Backplot, Verify, and Simulation, and all of those tools are available in an interface called the Mastercam Simulator. Before we begin, let's go through and review this part to see what we have to work with as far as stock models and toolpaths and the various setups. The part I have opened is called MCU3D Gas Pedal Verify. And as you can tell, we have a bunch of view sheets along the bottom, and we have a bunch of different toolpath groups. Let's start with Setup 1, and when I select it, using this option right here that says Only Display Selected Toolpaths, all of these toolpaths get displayed. You'll also see that Setup 1 down here is my current view sheet. At this point, with all of the toolpaths selected, we have a backplot option here, and as we saw earlier, this backplot brings up a backplot interface which is currently in our Mastercam session. So in other words, this backplot does not exit out of Mastercam. And it is a very quick way to go through and take a look at how this toolpath or toolpaths interact. And we're doing this just to review the various toolpath motion with this part before we look at it in the simulator. So right now you see that the stock model is displayed. And if we wanted to not display that, I would just select just the toolpaths I want to see. And I'm holding down the Control key to select these. And then hit Backplot. So now we're looking at the backplot in our current part without the stock model there. So this is essentially your roughing. And it's cleaning all this out. And then as you can see along the top here, we have the various colors that show different toolpaths. And we're getting into our finishing and then some of our pencil and drill toolpaths and so forth. If we look at the other setup down here, View Sheet Setup 2, you'll see that this flips the part around as if we were machining this. We also have Setup 2 Fixture and Setup 2 Fixture 2. Now back to Setup 1. If you take a look at our levels, you'll notice that we have a bunch of levels that are turned off. But for example, level 205 is our Kurt vise, and that holds the part in place for Setup 2. So if Setup 2 is turned on, and I turn on the vise, you'll see that that's how it's holding it right there. So this is important to note because we're going to be simulating Setup 2. So let's take a look at the Setup 2 toolpaths, and that's down here. We have our OptiRough, then we have a stock model, then we do some finishing, which looks like an equal scallop toolpath to really clean this up. Then dynamic mill toolpaths to clean out the holes. Then we have a curve 5-axis toolpath, and if I was to backplot this, you'll see that really what it does is it follows a curve in a 5-axis orientation. So it's really just cutting slots or grooves in this part. Then we have a transform toolpath that actually does the same thing, going in the opposite direction. So with Setup 2 selected, we can go right into Backplot or Verify to verify this. However, there's one other step we should do first, and that's to simulate the proper setup. So if we go into our options, we can choose exactly which level is used or levels is used as a fixture. So as an example, I have level 205, which is the Kurt vise, and level 201, which is fixture setup 2. That's going to be set up as our fixture. So in other words, in the Mastercam simulator, we can turn on and off our fixture, and these two levels and the geometry on those levels will be considered fixtures. We can also tell it what stock model to start with. Well, if you look here, number 15 is stock model. This was from setup 1, and this is the stock model right here. So let's choose that model. And it's stock model setup 1-5. So we have our stock model set up, and our fixtures chosen. So now with them selected, let's click on Verify. And when the simulator comes up, you'll notice that it's showing some green geometry down below. That green geometry is our fixture. So if we unselect that, notice it disappears. Turning it back on makes it reappear. That's because we chose those options in the simulator options here. The other thing we have here is some representation of a stock model. Well, if we go back to this stock model right here, which if you recall is setup 1-5, you'll see that that is the stock model. So we have everything set up as desired. Let's go back to the simulator and we'll maximize this. And before we maximize, you'll notice that when I rotate the part around in the simulator, the model in Mastercam also moves. That's because the views are synced. And inside the Mastercam simulator, under the View tab, you see Sync Views, and that's what that does. So let's look at what we're verifying here in the simulator. Since I clicked on Verify, we have the Verify tab. But if I went to Home, I could switch between Verify and Backplot. So I could go back into Backplot, and this is very, very similar to the Backplot we saw in Mastercam, but now it happens inside the simulator. So of course, for Backplot, we can display the tool or hide the tool. But in this case, I'd probably want to show my workpiece. Because remember, Backplot is like a wireframe verification, so we don't see any material removal. But with the workpiece shown and the fixture shown, I could also select the initial stock to show, but that's not going to help us because we're not going to see any of that material removed. So I'm going to turn that off. And let's hit play for a little bit and see what happens here. We have controls down here, such as how fast to go, and then also if we want to do performance versus precision. So the higher precise you are, the slower it goes. You could also cater to the sides of performance where it will go faster, however it'll be less precise graphically. Now, at this point, let's hit pause. You can see that we have toolpath motion here with some retracts. You can choose how you want to look at these operations. So for example, this will display all the operations. This will display just the current operation, which obviously makes sense that we're not going to see any difference because we're still in the current operation. You can also choose a segment of the operation. So if you do that, okay, you're not going to see much, but if I was to briefly turn off the tool, you'll see here that we see a segment. And if I step through it, that segment is only a portion of it. So if we wanted to modify what we're seeing in a segment, we can go to the File menu and click on Options. And we can choose it to display 100 moves before the current cut position. And when I click OK, just like we see what happens when we change something in Mastercam and it asks us to change a configuration file, we see the same thing here. I'm going to click No. And you'll see now if I zoom out that we see the last 100 moves for this current toolpath. Specifically, that's what segment is. So we're looking at a segment and it's the last 100. Now if I hit play, and let's just slow it down for a minute, you see how all of the toolpath motion is basically trailing it. It's like a tail. That's because it's the last 100 moves. Let's go back to all. And of course, you can see why that benefits us because right now we see a lot of toolpath motion on the screen. And sometimes it's very difficult to see exactly what we're trying to look at here with all this on the screen. So that's why you might want to go to segment. You can also do trace, follow, or both. So we had, when we have segment turn on, it's following. If we chose trace as well, or in other words, actually both, so follow and trace, we'll see 10 moves forward and 100 moves back because of the file options we chose here. So that's how the operations and the toolpath works. Let's zoom out here and look at some other options. So again, we're in Backplot within the Mastercam simulator, and we're adjusting exactly how our toolpath is being displayed. And let's do trace. So in this case, which is kind of interesting, as the material, or the toolpath rather, gets cut, the toolpath disappears. So this will show how the toolpath gets cleaned up, because as it's moving along the path, it disappears. And as you can see here, these lines are disappearing. So let's go back to stop. We'll choose follow, or in this case both, but we're doing all operations. And the last thing we're going to explore here is under the playback option, we have stop conditions. So often, if I have a very complex part, I'll tell it to stop after every operation change. So notice when I click it, that check turns on. Got to keep in mind though that this button, you have to turn it on to make the stop condition valid. Right now it's off, even though that's checked. So you have to go in here and physically click this on. So now it's going to stop at, in this case, an operation change. But as an example, you could also say, for example, you want it to stop anytime the Z value hits minus 0.1. Let's just say you're cutting in the positive Z and you know your table is at 0. Anytime you hit below 0, you want it to stop. You could do that as well. In the next lesson, we're going to take this file and expand on it, and we'll look at how it works within Verify and see how we can utilize the stock model to really interrogate our toolpath to make sure that we're doing exactly what we expect the toolpath to do.